Andrew's a regular speaker, so I'll let him introduce himself. I just gave a brief introduction about the hemp seeds and how I feel you were instrumental in getting that legalised in Australia. I did give some kudos to you too.
Thank you.
All part of the team.
All right. Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, my name's Andrew Kavasalis, not to be confused with Andrew Catalaris, who is the real Andrew who put in the applications to get hemp seed food up and going. But, you know, everything's a long story, and I don't, you know, when I talk about medical cannabis, I try to give people an insight into what's really going on. Why isn't medical cannabis going? What is medical cannabis? What are they really doing overseas? What is, you know, a prescription medical cannabis? Of what the actual hold-ups are. Here in Australia, we're a bit lucky. We've got a government that has willingly introduced some laws around medical cannabis and growing it for companies and so forth. But it's still quite complicated when you have a look at what that actually means. So, as a way to just make a declaration, I do have a company, VitaHemp, that we are probably one of the biggest hemp seed growers and processors and producers of hemp seed products, and I'm also involved. I founded another company called Medical Cannabis Limited, and we are now part of a bigger group of companies, Can Global. We own a company up in Brisbane that has federal approval for cultivation, processing, manufacture, import and export of medical cannabis products. We still have, even though with those licences, we still have a long way to go. We've got to fit this facility out. So I have a fair idea on what the government's saying, what they want the people to think is going on, and then what's actually going on. So when I first got into this, I went back to the original. I traced it back. Why is cannabis illegal? And we come up with, you know, you go back to the United Nations drug treaties, and that really is the overarching drug treaty for every country in the world. This is a treaty that ensures that every government can have all the drugs that they need for a whole medical system. But what it does also really illustrate is that no government owns any drugs. No government owns any drugs. And especially not opium, coca and cannabis. There's special things written about those three drugs. So when you accept that, you then have to accept that companies own all these drugs. Companies own insulin, companies own opiates, companies, they just own them. And they are grown, coca, opium and cannabis have been grown for medical purposes and scientific research. That's all written into the United Nations Drug Conventions. But the detail around all that is a lawful source. So you can't just be a company here in Australia or a person in Australia, go and get some illegal seed and, you know, attempt to legitimise it and make a medical cannabis company. That is not what it's about. But some countries, like we've seen in the US and Canada and Israel, are doing stuff. And so I had a look into what's actually going on there. So we'll go back to the earliest country, and that's Israel. Israel's been doing 30-odd years of research, just research. They have no products into medical cannabis. To get medical cannabis in Israel, you've got to go to first find a doctor. Less than 10% of the doctors help patients in Israel get access to it. You have to find a doctor who's going to do this recommendation for you that goes to a committee with the health department. If this committee says yes, they inform the patient, and then the patient can go to one of the 6 licensed or lawful growers over there. They explain their medical condition, and the grower tells the patient what they're going to have and how they're going to use it and what variety. So there's no doctors actually writing a prescription. But what's important, a lot of people would have heard of Raphael Mechoulam. He's kind of this Israeli researcher who's credited with discovering Delta-9 and really having a look into cannabinoids. But I've seen quite a few interviews with him, but I've actually seen some really good interviews where he addresses the situation for Israel. And he says pretty openly that all of the research done in Israel has all been under the direction of the DEA in the US. And so even to this day, a lot of all the research that happens in Israel has to go through the DEA. But importantly, no products have been made in Israel. In fact, for the first 15 years, a lot of their research was based in palliative care units in private kibbutzes, so still sort of removed from the general medical profession. At the moment, they're trying to make it look a bit more pharmaceuticalised, but primarily medical cannabis over there has been, that process of going to a doctor, getting a referral to a health department, your approval, and then you go to one of the growers, and generally you'll be supplied cannabis to smoke. In Canada, back in 2002, there was a court case, went to the High Court, the Allard Wilcox case, which found in favour of these two people who were being brought to justice for using cannabis for medical purposes. The High Court found that these people should be able to use cannabis. Now, the Constitution over in Canada, they also have a Charter of Rights, which gives the High Court the authority to order the government to initiate, to change laws. And that's what happened in 2002. The High Court gave the Canadian government 1 year to introduce a medical cannabis regime. They took 2 years, but there was a lot of components of that decision, including patients being able to access it quickly and whenever they want to, and things like that. And that's how the dispensaries came about. The dispensaries in Canada have always been illegal, federally. You've never, and yet we're seeing them all over the place. We're seeing a lot of flux at the moment. But we'll come back to Canada. But that's what happened with their medical cannabis regime. The initial one, they took 2 years. It was a bit of a flop. They started another one and tried to stop the first one. They started the second one. They couldn't, in the High Court, couldn't stop the first one. And then they started a new one, a third regime now, the LPs, the licensed producers, and they still haven't been able to stop the other two regimes. And they're back in the High Court now, trying to defend. This is, successive governments in Canada have run High Court challenges to stop progress. I was there in 2015 when the government lost another High Court challenge. The government was insisting that if you want to use cannabis for medical purposes, you have to smoke it. And the High Court found that no, if there's safer ways of using cannabis for medical purposes, i.e. extracts and oils and things like that, manufactured product, you should be able to do that. So that's how petty this all gets. And again, the government was forced to break these UN laws. Now, in the US, you've got the states, the United States of America, they have a constitution. 37 of those states, when they formed the union, signed up to a component, I forget what article it is, or what amendment, but it's got to do with citizens-initiated referendums, where the citizens of a state can get a petition together, and whether it's a full-term or a mid-term election, a question will be put on the ballot. And if you have a good look at any of the American elections, if you go state by state, there's always a few ballot questions, referendums that they have. So back in 1996, a guy called Dennis Perron in California got the necessary petition up and got Proposition 215 up. What's important to know, so this was going to an election, a referendum question about medical cannabis. What's important to know is the Californian government was against it, the health profession was against it, the federal government was against it, but the people voted and it got voted in. And there's certain points you have to understand. Where you see all this medical cannabis in these other states, it's important to know that it came about by citizens-initiated referendums, which we don't have here in Australia in our constitution, but also that all of those state governments opposed those measures. They all ran the No campaign, but they had to introduce it. And so it's never really received any full government support or backing, and that's why you'll never hear state governments talking about the positive consequences that have come about by the introduction of medical cannabis. So it's still, overriding all of these things are still, federal laws which make it illegal and the United Nations laws. So, and every time, I don't know if people are aware, we've had maybe a dozen state and federal parliamentary inquiries into medical cannabis. I don't even remember if people can remember when Bob Carr was the New South Wales Premier and they wanted to get medical cannabis up, but they just couldn't. They really did try. Politicians really do want to do it, but they just can't. At the end of the day, though, under pressure from all the media and really heartfelt stories that keep coming forward, you know, we're seeing governments bending laws and doing things which sort of still work and still keeps them within the, you know, for politicians, they come and go. I've been at this since 1999, growing cannabis under permit here in New South Wales. I've seen lots of politicians come and go, lots of health ministers. They want to help. Some of them personally want to help. I happen to know back when Premier Carr was here in New South Wales, when they were talking about medical cannabis, I think there was 4 members of the cabinet who had family members or loved ones who were using cannabis for medical purposes. They really wanted to do it, but they couldn't. For a number of reasons they couldn't. I was lucky enough, I got told a few reasons. One was also the doctor's insurer. So a doctor is not going to prescribe a product or recommend a product that's never been clinically trialled. And you always hear that kind of argument coming forward from politicians and the medical profession. There's not enough clinical trials, not enough's been done, we don't know enough about it. They're absolutely right. Forget what Google says, you know, there's umpteen thousand million research papers. Those research papers, a lot of those are based on individual cannabinoids, and test tube, in vitro, that kind of stuff. It's not the medical cannabis that's going on around the world. Medical cannabis primarily is, like in Canada and in the US and in Israel, you've got to... Canada's a little bit just like Israel. You've got to find one of the very few doctors who will actually help you get the recommendation from Health Canada for you to smoke high THC cannabis, for you to get the okay to go to a dispensary and buy whatever pot you want to smoke. That's what medical cannabis is. In the US, it's even easier. It's like if you have a look at prohibitions, it's like they've legalised moonshine. So it's not really a medical cannabis regime, but it's more an exemption process that allows you to smoke high THC. So when our government talks about medical cannabis, they're really talking about pharmaceuticalised cannabinoid medicines that would be specifically prescribed by a medical practitioner. In our case, the government has made up certain rules and policies and regulations about doctors being an authorised prescriber. And again, it's not really a prescription. Ultimately, what that doctor really needs to know is that if they recommend a particular product, so our government is now also bending rules to bring products in from Canada, for instance, whose medical cannabis companies became evolved from these court orders, ordering the government to allow this to happen. There is now this assumption, and you know, our government is giving these companies now some kind of international legitimacy to bring these products over. And I have to admit, the products that are coming over here from Canada, that's not the products that people over there are using for medical cannabis. So we're bringing some in. So the authorised prescriber regime is really about the government undertaking indemnity, so giving the doctor indemnity. So we really have these low-dose products, and low-dose cannabis products are really good, you know, for a lot of different conditions, especially kiddies and and people with generally non-chronic conditions. They work. But yeah, like I said, what most people are using are basically high THC cannabis products, generally smoked, but we are seeing a lot more people now using oils, which are very, very effective. Most people in Australia, though we seem to live in a bubble here in Nimbin, we think everyone smokes pot. But the reality is most people in Australia don't smoke pot, and most people who are going to benefit by the use of cannabis for medical purposes have never smoked cannabis, they've never been stoned, they'll never need to get stoned or smoke it. These oils are more than enough and more than efficient, but they're not tested, they're not tried and true. They're made from high THC cannabis, which would otherwise have been smoked in the recreational market. It's the same cannabis, there's no medical cannabis and recreational. And like I said, yeah, medical cannabis is overseas, is smoking high THC cannabis. When our government talks about medical cannabis, it's talking about a form of pharmaceuticalised cannabinoid medicines, which really haven't been made yet. And again, going back to the parliamentary inquiries we've had here in Australia, they always refer to the UN drug conventions and the obstacles stopping this from happening here or around the world. So in order for a company to even develop a medical cannabis product, they have to have a lawful source. So just like, Australia, just briefly, Australia grows half the opium required for the legal opiate market and morphine and that kind of thing required for the world. What the breakdown of that is two companies, GlaxoSmithKline and Johnson & Johnson, they own the lawful source of those genetics and they contract our farmers to grow it. The farmers don't own the crop. It would even be an offence for them to go and save any seeds to give to somebody else or anything. They're just growing it on contract. It's harvested, the opiates are extracted, refined and turned into medicines. If a company wants to do medical cannabis products, first you've got to find a lawful source. Monsanto has owned medical cannabis, or the only lawful source of cannabis, as described in the UN Drug Conventions for medical and scientific research, for about 45 years. At the end of 2016, Bayer purchased Monsanto for $93 billion. It's probably got more to do with shifting, a bit like Hardy's and that, before the Roundup cases start coming through. It's all changed now, so we probably won't be able to go for Monsanto. But yeah, Bayer bought Monsanto. In doing that, they also gained access to the only lawful source of cannabis in the world. And this was leading to another little point, another little snippet that people should be, you can look it up on the web, whatever, about the first prescription cannabis medicine. When our governments say, even we had our Prime Minister saying, as long as, cannabis can be prescribed by a doctor, or you can go to your doctor now and get a prescription for cannabis. Well, it was only a couple of months ago, the FDA approved the first prescription cannabis medicine. And that's very important, and it's exactly right. It doesn't matter what our governments and other people are saying here in Australia. No, the first one, proper prescription drug, only just got registered. It's called Epidiolex, and it's for paediatric epilepsy. This is from a company that Bayer is very involved with, GW Pharmaceuticals, and that kind of highlights what I talk about in terms of a lawful source. There was a company back maybe 15, 20 years ago, GW Pharmaceuticals in Britain. The British government broke all the laws and let one company access illegal seed to start growing it, to form a company, to float it on the stock exchange. And they produced a product, a spray called Sativex. Sativex has been used by governments all over the world for about the last 15 years. Whenever the medical cannabis debate comes up, they all point to, we're going to do Sativex, we're going to pay for clinical trials. And all of a sudden, if you have a look at our headlines and what they talk about here, and especially about clinical research, it turns out our governments are paying these companies to do their clinical research here. It's not how it's supposed to be, and these trials are really only for really small and specific patient groups. They're not for wider, bigger patient groups of chronic pain and long-term suffering that people are enduring. I don't want to take anything away from the paediatric epilepsy drug that's just come up, which is saving lives of children with otherwise intractable conditions, but it's still not allowed to be used as a first line. It's still, you've got to try all the other pharmaceutical drugs, experience all those side effects for these are young kids before you can use this cannabis product. And so that's kind of where we're at. I'm just trying to bring this around to some positives at the moment, but that really is the hold-up. And yeah, it comes down to politics, and if we had strong politicians who would move the debate forward, and we started talking about how our government will address the UN stuff. So we get back to Canada and recreational, as probably everyone's aware of now, that on the 17th of October of this year, the Canadian government willingly introduced regulations around non-medical use of cannabis, recreational. They regulated, taxed it, problem solved. How they did that was quite extraordinary. All they did was they wrote out a policy. They went to the last election saying, if you vote us in, this is Trudeau, if you vote us in, we're going to legalise recreational. They've had experience enough now with medical cannabis. Their road tolls went down, the alcohol consumption went down, mental health issues went down, antisocial behaviour problems went down. Or meant the burden on the medical on the medical budgets and health budgets went down. But you don't hear them crowing about it much because they were forced to do it. And like I said, they've fought like they're up to about their 12th High Court challenge to stop progress. But what's more, with this recreational, I think we should be looking there, and there is positives there. If in fact, the Canadian government has now broken the big taboo. They're allowing non-medical use of recreational cannabis, and they've taken it a step further than Amsterdam. The Netherlands, overall, the Netherlands laws are still that cannabis is illegal. It's illegal everywhere in the world, but they have a low priority on chasing up cannabis use. So they had such a low priority that you can open up a coffee shop as long as you get council DA approval and it's okay, and this is all over the country. But they have no regulated supply regime. So there's still people in the Netherlands going to jail for growing large amounts of cannabis to supply the coffee shops. It's actually called a backdoor policy. Anyway, it's pragmatic and it works for them, and that's just how it works. So Canada, though, no, the government went one step further. They're regulating the supply and everything in contravention of the UN Drug Convention. So if nothing happens, and this is what I'm trying to impress upon people now, and we take that debate in that direction, if nothing happens to Canada for doing such a move, if there is no international consequences, if the pharmaceutical companies don't up the price of their drugs, if drugs aren't withheld, if Australia is not going to initiate any sanctions against Canada for breaking these rules, there's no reason why an Australian government shouldn't develop and introduce and maybe table. So what the Canadians did also when they wrote that policy, they tabled it at the UN, and there's stories about it. It was at a convention it was at a big meeting that was titled A Drug-Free World, We Can Do It. So at the UN level, they still believe that we can end all drug use in the world. Anyway, they tabled this. We don't know what happened. We don't know what the response was, but in May of this year, the UN again warned Canada to not regulate recreational use of Canada. And I read in UN News yesterday, which is a publication, it's a web-based publication. Again, the United Nations is not happy with what Canada's done. I think that if it goes on and nothing happens, there's no reason why an Australian government shouldn't develop a meaningful medical cannabis regime in the sense of the word, even if it's at an interim measures until pharmaceuticalised cannabinoids come along. Because by and large, that's what's going to help most people in the future, not smoking cannabis, but it will be something that you will be able to go to a doctor, you will be able to just get a prescription, go to your pharmacy and get a medicine that is quite benign but is going to give you incredible benefits for a little price. That's what the future, I think, is. But how quickly move in that direction is big question marks about it. But I think that an interim measures plan, another hat I wear is from the Hemp Party, the Australian Hemp Party, and we have written up a set of interim measures, and we've delivered them to Shorten's office, and they really like them. And within a couple of weeks, the Shadow Health spokesperson, Catherine King, was quoted in the paper saying that they had recently written to the government to introduce interim measures in relation to medical cannabis. So at the Hemp Party level, at the level where we believe we can really help a majority of people in the short term, would be interim measures for maybe it could be 5, 10, 15 years. This is like any new drug development, you know. Nearly weekly on some current affair or news show, you'll see the story always goes that, you know, somebody's found something new, then they go to the shot of the laboratory with test tubes and how great this is going to be in the future for patients, and it usually finishes off with the health minister saying, answering the question how long it's going to be. It's usually 5 to 10 years, as long as everything goes well, and it costs a lot of money to do all those clinical trials. So that's where medical cannabis is really on the pharmaceutical side, and where most people are going to find benefit in the future. So, you know, I hope I haven't put people off too much, but I hope it helps people understand the kind of pace we're looking at, the kind of seismic shift in the debate that we'll need to see before we can really accept that, yes, governments are doing something real. Yeah. So,
questions?
Questions coming up?
One question?
Yeah, word is that the UN is meeting next month to take cannabis off the Poisons Act. I haven't verified that, but this is what I've heard. Have you heard about that? And if so, what would be the implications of that happening?
okay, well, when we're talking about the United Nations and the World Health Organisation, we're talking about the full medical journey of any drug development. So what they're talking about is rescheduling. Well, another thing, there's two things going on. It turns out when they made cannabis illegal, they didn't do a critical review. So whenever new drugs come on the market, they have to go through clinical trials, and they're always critically reviewed. Again, the pressure is building up around the world around cannabis, so they found this other, another avenue to slow things down. So yeah, what they're talking about is rescheduling. Descheduling CBD on one hand, so it doesn't even apply to any kind of medical cannabis or any kind of medical laws. It's just a descheduled. It's like hemp seed food, or there's no medicine around it. Or otherwise, if they put it into a schedule, like a Schedule 4 or Schedule 8, that just means a company can now develop a drug from that schedule. If it was Schedule 9, like cannabis has always been, there's no medical value, no medical, nothing of medical value. So a company couldn't even begin to start evaluating that to try and develop a medical cannabis product. In Australia, we've now put THC in Schedule 8. It's up there with opiates, so yeah, a company can do it, but it's still got to be from a lawful source, but only develop a new drug, which takes millions of dollars in clinical trials. CBD in Australia is Schedule 4 at the moment. A company it's a lot easier than a Schedule 8 drug to develop a pharmaceuticalised cannabinoid medicine from. So yeah, there are all these long paths that we have to go down, but that's why interim measures would be important in the meantime for a lot of people. And yeah, also, another really important factor which we're all going to be experiencing and seeing in the near future, and could be in the medium term, is the negative consequences if governments don't hurry up and do something about medical cannabis. What we're seeing at the moment is this huge influx of people using cannabis from the black market, or what we're going to actually start calling the alternate medical cannabis market. So the alternate market has been going great guns. It's expanded incredibly. And, we've still only got 1,000 people buying a little bit of product off this white market that they're developing. But, keeping laws in force that the public don't support leads to a lot of corruption. That's just what happens. Woods Royal Commission for any New South Wales folk. If you've ever had a look at the Woods Royal Commission and the corruption in New South Wales Police Force, we've got too much sound down here. The Woods Royal Commission found that, we should legalise prostitution, gambling, and cannabis has been mentioned several times, just merely because of the corruption that was around it. Victimless crimes, people do it anyway, the people don't really support that kind of enforcement. So we're in that same situation now, where there's going to be all these negative consequences compounding if we don't hurry up.
Sorry. The companies that are allowed to grow, are they growing genetically modified seed?
No, there'll be no. Cannabis is one of these. I see that bandied around a bit. Cannabis is so easy to breed. It's a boy and a girl. No one's going to go to the trouble of genetically modifying it. It's very easy to grow, very easy to breed. In fact, they describe it as being plastic. The most you might see is a company might put a marker, so it might have an increased level of magnesium or something like that. That would be the very most. We're a long, long way away from that. Yeah. Synthetic cannabinoids are another story. Synthetic cannabinoids are a lot easier to use, fit right into the medical drug development scheme, where the TGA, when you're developing a new drug, what they'd really like you to do is have the active compound working on a specific condition, and that's it. That's why they synthesise. They might find a component of a plant or a botanical, they'll refine it, synthesise it, and just work on a particular medical complaint. Synthetics are another thing, yeah.
But synthetic cannabis that people buy to smoke is totally poisonous.
Synthetic cannabinoids are molecules that are designed to mimic the effects of a cannabinoid, or mimic the effect of a molecule in the system. So synthetic cannabinoids won't show up on a saliva test because it's not delta-9, it's not that. It's a molecule that mimics the effects of what that does to your body, and to quite a variable extent too. That's why, yeah, you can't really trust them. Yeah.
They've just been developed to get around drug tests. Hey, I've got to wind up. I really want to thank Andrew for talking to us.
Thanks, Michael.
And I've got to ask you a couple of questions. I want to know how come you heard about this weekend. Did you hear it on Facebook? Who heard it on... How come you came here today? Who heard it on Facebook? Who heard it through the news or radio? How did you hear about it? Through the Hemp Embassy? Yeah. Coming to the embassy.
University.
Word of mouth?
University sending out information.
That's great. Which university?
AC.
That's Dolphs. That's great. Excellent. And we do, from the Hemp Embassy, we do a weekly mail out called their headlines, which will... It's a free thing. If you put your email address out there on a form, you'll get an email once a week of kind of what's happening globally, on cannabis especially. It's worth doing. And there's a book out there called Chasing the Scream. I fully recommend you buy it. It's a great read. And if you had a good... I hope you're coming back tomorrow, a lot of you. It'll be a different day with similar people, but lots more info. And if you are or if you're not, do tell your friends. Because the next time we're doing this, only every 3 months, will be January 1920. So, I have to wind up.
It's 4:20.
4:20. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And Sista, Disco Sister over here, thank her very much for her input.
20th and 21st.
We'll be recording it
No,
at the end.
1920.
To be on
20th and
YouTube.
21st. I put the signs out.
I think it's the 19th and 20th of January, but we'll check.
It's written
It's
on
the
the wall.
weekend.
It's 1920 January. Saturday, Sunday.
They're putting the wrong things up.
You printed them.
Do ask questions outside. If you've got more questions, we're into it. And thanks very much for being here.
CBD would be your modulator. THC works on CB1, CBD doesn't. CBD actually blocks CB1, not the high. But it actually just works on all of these. CBD is a form of drug. It modulates like oil next to your car. It makes your car regular high flow, high spirit. It cancels diabetes. It actually modulates the pancreas. It works on your neurons so that you produce more anandamide. Anandamide is your endogenous hormone. So it actually makes you produce more cannabis.
And even in Canada, you've got these other clinics set up for patients out of the clinic. These guys don't want cannabis because the doctors don't know. And there's a go-between. We've got these clinics in Australia that just cannabis access clinics, except they apply to their own doctors. But if there's a specialist applied, they'll have a network of specialists that they work with. So that's even what's happening now. So in Canada, it's starting now, the government has some. And people are getting here, they find that $300 in products pretty suboptimal in the street. And a bit more expensive. But anyway, the government's taking, so they must be doing something right. What's happening in Canada now? There's more doctors when patients do ask them about medical cannabis, rather than doing all this paperwork, they're just going to say, go and buy some recreational. Go and buy some. The medical community doesn't make drugs. The AMA doesn't make drugs. But we need intramural. Clinical trials. When we talk about trials, different products, different conditions, billions of dollars.
And different mutations and...
Yeah, 10, 15, 20 years. So yeah, intramural, we hope, we're going to keep talking about it. We talk about the shortness of it.